Hello, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to Voices of Resiliency, a podcast exploring the impact of crisis on children and youth. We partnered with Sherry from Lead Services, and our topic is disasters. We are a group of 5 fourth-year Bachelor of Child Studies students at Mount Royal University, completing our capstone project. This season's focus is children coming from war-torn countries, so if you want to hear more about that, stay tuned.
Welcome to episode 3. If you happen to tune into our last episode, we had a very special guest speaker that was here to tell us more about the resilience of refugees who may be fleeing countries afflicted by conflict. If you missed that and want to hear more about what we discussed, it is currently available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Now for today's topic, we will be discussing how early childhood educators can offer support to children from war zones. My name is Kaylee.
My name's Willa.
And I am Alyssa. Today we have an amazing opportunity to actually have one of our professors from Mount Royal joining us. A big welcome to Carolyn Bjartveit.
Woohoo!
Thank you.
Would you like to do an introduction on yourself and share a little bit more about who you are to our listeners?
Yes. First, I'd like to say thank you for inviting me today. It's really an honor to be asked. I'm Carolyn Bjartveit, an associate professor teaching in the Bachelor of Child Studies degree in the Early Learning degree program. And I have had, 15 years of teaching preschool. And then followed by that, I went into post-secondary teaching and have taught at undergraduate and graduate level early childhood education programs. So Mount Royal's my home now, and I'm just so thrilled to be teaching here and lovely to be with my students. So thank you again for having me.
That's fantastic. So we thought we'd start off with a question asking kind of what do you think people in the field should know when they're working with children from war-torn countries?
That's a really important question, and I have to say that when I received the description of this podcast, I appreciated the fact that you talked about the unique needs of children. I think it's important to remember that children come with their own stories and their own lived experiences, and assumptions can sometimes be made that generalize the impact of war on children. And people might assume that because they've come from an area of conflict, that they need particular therapeutic interventions or supports. But we must remember that it's contextual, that every child comes with their own story. So that's a really, really important point. Another point is understanding the impacts of war. So in addition to experiencing grief and trauma caused by war, it's important to know, unless we've experienced ourselves, or I don't think we can even imagine what it's like to be in situations of displacement where you're moving from place to place, sometimes multiple times, and then separated from family, separated from friends. Refugee children arrive and they're in a new environment, they're juggling cultural differences, even food is different, celebrations in the new country are different, and at the same time, they're holding the memories from home, from family, and they have some very, concerning and difficult past memories.
That's where it's really important to understand that the children come with their own set of who they are and not just trying to adapt them right into the new culture immediately.
Absolutely.
I think here at MRU we also talk a lot about children being like part of that web, they're so interconnected and tied to like everyone else in their lives, like their family, their siblings, and they can't be like considered in isolation without those things. And so I think that's a really good point. Yeah.
Another thing, too, I was reading some journal articles, and in the European Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Journal, scholars have wrote about some of the impacts of war and displacement, and it talked about it's important to understand the immediate psychological distress and stress reactions in children, and some of them are psychosomatic, which means they might exhibit tummy aches, headaches when they're in the playroom. They might show anxiety, distress, triggered by many things from their past experiences and separation from family members. And there could be sleep disturbances and interruptions as well. So that is something that educators might see in the playroom or in the classroom. And so it's really important to be aware of some of those symptoms and behaviors that might occur. Another one that came up that was really interesting to me, and this came in an article in 2024, so it's really new, about the negative impacts of parental conscription. I don't know if you've heard of that before. Have you?
I'll let you explain.
So what it means is that children may, like dads, brothers, uncles, may be required to go into battle, into conflict zone. And the child is displaced, moving from place to place, must leave their country perhaps. And so they're carrying the fear of their loved ones that are in conflict zones while they're adjusting, right? So that was something that was missing in the academic literature, according to these scholars, and so it was interesting that is sort of a new finding, and that their finding is really impacting children.
I feel like that's really been prominent with the Ukraine-Russia war. Like I know a lot, actually probably a couple families that have come over here without their fathers, as their father has had to stay back and fight. And that's a lot of it's an added stressor, added everything for that child.
That's a really good point, because it's a layering. When you think about it being the layering of so many changes, and then they come into a playroom and, meeting new peers, new teacher.
That's quite surprising that's such like new research. Like I feel like that's been an ongoing.
Yeah, and yes. Yeah. And I will be very happy to leave you the list of the articles that I've referred to, and for your future reference if you're putting information together. Yes, but it's a new finding. Yes. Yeah. One other thing is, and I mentioned it before, is to just it is important. I'll emphasize again, gathering information, resources, literature, speaking to professional organizations about preparing ahead and understanding what we might observe in the classroom and who we can consult with for support when we have children come into our playrooms.
Because we need the support as well.
That's why a podcast like this is even existing, so that someone who doesn't know what to do can come find this and learn what to do.
I'm so glad you raised that, because self-care is really important. We become the holders, the carriers of stories, and we keep them with us. We carry them with us, and so we can't just blot them out or delete them. So how do we continue to work with the children when we're carrying that? And so finding ways to look after ourselves is really crucial. Yeah. Really good point.
Yeah. Speaking of which, you've been in the field for like a long time. you suggested earlier. No. But do you have any like experiences like firsthand with any of this stuff? Like, I don't know, that you want to share?
Well, I have another story I'll tell you in a few minutes. Not related to war, but another trauma that children experience. However, I did work in a community program years ago where refugee children were there and participating, and noted how when meals came out, food was prepared and laid out for the children for lunch, the children would want to take the food and maybe tuck it away in places, like they were wanting to keep it for later. And some people in the room didn't understand that and were saying no, but without really understanding that maybe they had gone through a period without having food available, right? And I think that memory has always stayed with me, sort of the not really having that understanding of what children experienced, and that it's a survival strategy that that they're exhibiting. They're wanting to make sure that they have something later on because there might not be food available.
And that just shows the impact of trauma-informed care and knowing there's probably a reason for this. The child isn't just taking food just because.
And the importance of context and considering the context of a child.
I mean, our current world is a little crazy right now, so I think, and we haven't been in early learning classes in a couple years, with all the current events, like, do you think in teaching EL classes and being kind of in that environment firsthand, do you think this kind of topic has shifted our current practice as ELs?
Yes, I think what you had just mentioned about trauma-informed practice is crucial. And when there's humanitarian crisis, which there has been in recent years, there is possibility of an exodus from countries, like the Syrian refugee crisis, where there were numbers of people leaving Syria and going into European countries and coming to North America and coming into schools. And so it's quite different from having one or two children in your classroom or your playroom who have come from war-torn countries than having half of a class. So how do we prepare for that? And I think that's very much maybe what you've been doing in your capstone project is emergency and preparation proactively to be prepared for what can happen. And I found an article by educators with the Calgary Board of Education who wrote in 2017 about this. They said Tweedy is the author, and his co-authors said that teachers will rely on school psychologists, for instance, to come in, but they can only handle so much. And so it's really important that all teachers engage in some kind of trauma-informed care and teaching. That's very, very, very important. 100%. And you might know, and programs that are available, I mean, going online, there's lots of organizations including government health sites that will offer courses in trauma-informed care. Have you been talking about that in your courses?
We've been talking quite a bit about trauma-informed care, especially with our upcoming webinar in March. Just a little plug for that. But yeah, I think that's a big topic in my group's discussion for that, because we're talking about some interventions that both ELs and CYs can use in helping children. And I think, like, I'm probably going to use some of the resources you bring in today to talk there. But yeah, trauma-informed care, I think, is one of our big topics for ours.
That's excellent. Another current practice is to create a safe and predictable environment. When you consider children are in war zones where they're hearing shelling, or there's all of a sudden loud noises around them day and night, and there's no sort of sense of predictability to what might happen next. Coming to a place where you can create a supportive, calm environment where there's safety and predictability with routines and whatnot is, I think, something that is a good idea, good plan for children.
I even think having a space within, like, the child's play area where that child knows that they can go if they need to, that is safe and secure for them. That way they have that almost outlet of that space that they can go to when they feel they need is a really good practice as well.
When children are leaving from countries affected by war, I feel like their voice can often be taken away from them in some kind of way, whether parents are not sharing certain information because it's difficult to talk about, or they just maybe don't speak the language. Like, these kind of things are happening, and to offer, like, agency or a space where they can speak out about what they want or want to see, I think is important too. And the space can be a way to do that as well. So
it's excellent, yeah. What you mentioned about having places where children can go, it was interesting. When I was in Italy, I went to the schools of Reggio Emilia, and in those classrooms, in the schools, they had hideaway places, even for babies. So babies could crawl out of their bassinets or their little beds, which they had on the floor, so that children had freedom to get out of bed during nap time. And the babies could crawl into these little places, and there were curtains across, and the educators really respected that privacy and just didn't go in and interrupt children if they went or into those spaces. And so I think that's a really, really lovely thing, you know, giving them the privacy when they need it and the calm and the quiet. So
Place to regulate.
yes, yeah. Another point I thought was allowing time to build relationships with parents, and you talked about that earlier about relationships with parents. Sometimes it takes time. Sometimes people are willing to share, and other times they're not. So really honoring their privacy and working with them on their own time and building those relationships and an environment of trust is so important, so that they feel comfortable to be able to share when they feel that they want to or that they're ready to share. So, and like you said, listening, observing, and joining children's play. It takes time, but you really get to understand their interests and their ideas when you watch their play. So we'll talk more about play in a minute, I think.
100%.
Yeah, just moving on from that, I guess, is like talking about ECE techniques and strategies that you can use like in the space. What about the impact of like storytelling or narrative therapeutic practices for children? In my research, I kind of found one that was called like it was a fairy tale therapy, where they kind of they have like a therapeutic character and then like a clear plot, and then it kind of has to mirror the child's experiences in some way, and then they kind of work through that, and it serves as like an outlet for children to rewrite their experiences like from their own perspective. So I don't know if you want to share a little bit more about that. I know you have a lot of to say about that kind of stuff.
I just love that thought of fairy tale. Well, that's amazing. Yeah, now I want to look that up.
Yeah, I can send you the link to the article.
That's amazing. I just think that storytelling goes hand in hand with play. And so sometimes in the playroom, there's these little short segments of time for play. You know, they might give even 20 minutes, half an hour. But if there's extended long periods, children will get into what I call the play zone. They have the opportunity of going deep into play. And it's in those periods that their cultures come out, their lived experiences are uncovered, their interests and whatnot are uncovered. So allowing those long, lengthy periods of playtime is really, really valuable. And then adding in props, puppets, which is my favorite. All my students know I have a huge puppet collection, and I still collect. I even had one for Christmas under the Christmas tree this year. I can't give it up. I just love them. And children will talk to a puppet and will explain to a puppet what they won't say to an adult very often, right? So it's they're very, very valuable that way. The other thing too is pedagogical documentation. And what I mean by that is when educators take the time to photograph children in play or write down their stories, use video, of course all with consent from the child and the family. That is a beautiful way to revisit their stories with the children and with their parents. And sort of ask, you know, what do you see? What can you add to this? What does this mean? Your interpretation of what your child was doing, and opens up conversation. So I can share an example. This is the different type of trauma I had mentioned earlier. Not war, different. But years ago, I worked in a school with children who were recovering from treatment for medical reasons, cancer and hematological illness. And one day, when I was in the class with the children, I put out a pirate set, a ship and little pirate figures, and there was a little crocodile. And I sat by and watched the children. And one child moved the crocodile close to the ship in a threatening way, and another child yelled out, "Quick, stick the crocodile with the sleepy medicine." And I listened and I thought, wow, you know, what would children often say? They might say, get the cannon or do some other way to deal with the crocodile. But the children revealed to me in that moment their lived experience with medications, with maybe anesthetics, going to sleep for surgical procedures. And it came out in their play in such an amazing way. And then I was able to talk to the children about it later and to their parents. So it's just an example, like I say, not connected specifically to the topic we're on today, but a different type of trauma, but a good example of how it was exhibited through their play.
Yeah. And this podcast is like geared towards like early childhood educators, but also like the broader audience too. And I think play can be generalized to be thought as like something that children are just doing. They're not actually learning anything, like these kind of things. But that's just such a great example of there's actually so much happening during play. And
and working through things too, like they figure out what the sleeping medicine does and how it can affect them and how it affects other people, like just working through the logic and understanding of those sort of concepts as well.
And a sense of control over what is happening. Or what they're experiencing.
Bringing their own lived experience into that and relating their own life into these stories, into their play. And that's another reason why fairy tale therapy and stories can be so impactful, because a lot of the time, like even I will watch a movie and I'll see myself in a character, and that's why I like the movie. As a kid, I would see myself in the story, and that's what would draw me to it. And that's what can be so impactful, because a child can see their lived experience actually happening.
And I think it's Vivian Paley who, in The Boy, I forget, The Boy in the Helicopter or something. What's that title?
The boy with the brown crayon, I think. But
there's one with a helicopter or something. The boy with a...
I might read, maybe the one I'm going to read is the one you're meaning.
Well, she just talks about play being like an outlet for children to also work through fear.
Yes.
Which you probably see very common with kids coming from war-torn country, the fear of, like we said, their father possibly being back in the war-torn country still, and they're working through that through their play, and you see all that being displayed.
I think it really points to the image of the child. I wanted to mention that earlier, that what I mean by image of the child is how do we view children? And in the West, in Western society, there's a tendency to say that we see children as strong and capable, but our actions toward them may not match what we say. So we may overprotect, we may do everything for them. But when you consider that children, whether in this scenario that I just read, or children in war, have survived some of the most difficult circumstances in life, they've problem solved, they've exercised agency, they've used critical thinking, they have exhibited strength. And so we tend to maybe look in a deficit way or think, oh, well, we need to, they need all of this therapeutic intervention. I'm not saying they don't. Definitely the support is needed contextually for each child. But at the same time, it's remarkable when you think of how strong, and maybe we need to shift and advocate for children in that way, really look at what they have managed to come through and really honor who they are and their strengths and capabilities. Yeah.
That was beautiful. Yeah, so true.
Paley, did you mention, sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, we could talk about
I'm talking
Paley,
too much.
yeah.
Let's talk about, so Vivian Paley. She was an early childhood educator who taught young children for more than 30 years. Yeah. And when she passed away at 90, the New York Times put an article about her, and she said she was, this is a quote, she was a keen observer and listener of young children. She wrote 13 books about their social and intellectual development, including how they learned from telling stories. So her use of drama and puppetry offered opportunities for dramatic play, and she used to have the children tell her the story, and she'd write it down, and then they would dramatize it. They would act it out. And there are in her books examples of trauma. So I brought one. Is it okay if I read a little section here? So this is from her book, A Child's World, The Importance of Fantasy Play. And it's the story of a little boy named Vijay who has come into the playroom from India, newly arrived in the playroom. Vijay has not yet sort of settled in and involved with the children. He's kind of standing back. But the topic of the World Trade Center tragedy came up in the classroom. It was around the time that 9/11 happened. Mm-hmm. And so this is what happened. This is what she wrote. A child said to Vijay, "Hey, you want to bomb us?" asked the blonde boy who's rebuilding the tower of blocks that's just exploded. It seems a gracious invitation, but Vijay shakes his head, not ready to take direction yet. There's another way in this classroom to enter the culture of the community and the world of childhood. So he sits down at the story table. "I have a story," Vijay says softly, surprising his teacher, who sits at the table writing the stories that the children dictate to her. This is the first time Vijay has offered to tell her a story without her encouragement. His story has no other outlet at school, since he did not tell it to the tower builder in the blocks. He might have waited until he got home, but perhaps there would be no one there ready to listen. Clearly, he could not wait. His story must be told now, and the words just tumbled out. "This was a plane," he begins, "and then it went to O'Hare and it picked up my grandpa last year. And my grandma was at Madras, and then she went to India, and we went to the Westin Hotel building, and the plane crashed into O'Hare and into the Westin Tall building. And then they fixed the plane, and they had to fix all the people. And they were going home, but they couldn't fix the building. It was on fire." So the teacher gave Vijay a solemn look. "Who will you be when we act out your story?" she asked. "In this class, the dictated story is but a half-told tale. To fulfill its destiny, it's dramatized on a pretend stage with the help of classmates as actors and audience and the teacher as narrator and director." "The plane," Vijay says, rolling his plane toy back and forth on the table. He waits a moment and then adds, "Do you know what Vijay means? It means victory." "Vijay means victory? I'm glad you told me that," but the teacher needs more information. "Will we see the plane being fixed and the people too?" "Yes," Vijay says. "How do you say the fixers? Mechanics?" the teacher suggests. He nods. "And a doctor for the people, and the ambulance, and the firemen too, but not a loud noise." So the teacher writes down the additional directions. "Victory," she repeats. "When the people go home in your story, it's another victory."
How sweet.
And then another child comes in after and says, "You need a T-Rex in your story." And so the imagination of children just comes out in such an amazing way.
My favorite part of working with kids, the random things they say, and you're like, huh?
But then again, later, Vijay, after he tells his story, he starts to play. And he goes into the block center, and he becomes sort of the center of the play because he has shared his story. But what I love about that is looking at the teacher practice, right?
Yeah.
What did you notice about that?
The active listening and the true, just like, I want to know what you have to say. I want to hear what you're saying. And asking those questions that aren't like, is it like this? Yes or no. It's when she replaced the word mechanic for plane fixers, that was just providing to his vocabulary rather than being like, oh, correcting. Mm-hmm. And that was what really stuck out to me.
Yeah, the listening, the observing, but the documenting, right? Writing the story, and then it goes into other ways of sharing.
Yeah.
In this case, it went into a book, but I'm sure that the teacher revisited with the parents and with pedagogical documentation. I don't see it as a practice. I see it as an art form. It just really is a beautiful way of opening up stories and children having opportunities to share more deeply.
I also I also think in that story, like, there's a tendency for anyone to avoid certain topics with children as well, and like these are topics that we should be talking about with children, especially if they are the ones that are trying to approach it or bring it up. So I think the way the teacher addressed it too is kind of like, yes, talk to me about these things that maybe you don't get to talk to anybody else about or share with anyone else, you know.
You made a good point, Kaylee, about allowing the children to bring the topic forward. We wouldn't sit down at circle time and say, let's talk about what's happening in a certain part of, you know, that's not something we do. But when children offer ideas or have questions, then it's an open opportunity to probe deeply, find out what are you thinking, you know, and see how we can
allow them to work through it and understand their curiosities deeper.
Right.
Yeah. I also really like how the story got shared with the other children and brought the other children's awareness to it so that they can, as a whole class, grow and become one, essentially. Be there for each other.
Yes. Yeah. It's powerful. Her work is powerful. Vivian's work deeply inspired my teaching practice. When I was working with 4 and 5-year-olds, I read all of her books, and she's been a bit of my hero. And so when I met her in the States at a conference, she signed my copy of the book, and it's a treasure. Because and I'm just so grateful for what I learned from her about storytelling and play, and how it opens up a child's world to teachers.
You are like the modern day Vivian.
Oh my God. I don't think I can begin to be like Vivian.
all the video footage I see of her and like all her stuff, like you remind me so much of her.
Oh, that's quite an honor. Oh, thank you.
I think we can kind of shift a little bit and we can start to talk about one of my favorite topics that we talked about in one of my favorite classes that we did, and talk about dark play and fantasy play and how that can be assistance to children escaping war-torn countries. That day that we did dark play was amazing because there weren't that many of us who showed up to that class in the CDL, but it was, and for our listeners, Child Development Lab, but that was, I think, the class that stuck out to me the most from learning through play.
Oh, wow, that's really special.
Do you want to talk a little bit about what we did in that class?
I remember we all had to, like, come up with our own activity that involved dark play. So I think I brought out lightsabers or something like that. But we had the room dark, and we all just experienced dark play and actually played through the things that we often don't get to. A lot of the times in schools, they'll be like, oh, no guns, no swords, no violence, or anything like that. So I think dark play in this context has a place.
Well, I was excited when I saw that you might ask a question about dark play. So we have to remember that as we talked before, children's experiences might cause fears, prolonged crying, many different types of aggressive behaviors in the class, and they might come up with morbid play themes. And so we have to define dark play. What are we talking about? And that could be play scripts that include violence, death, abduction. It could be gunplay is a perfect example, right? Where a child will pick up any toy or any object and it becomes a weapon. And very often, what happens with that in the playroom?
It gets shut down.
It gets shut down, right? And for reasons, right? I mean, fear of protecting children and fear of safety issues. So there is reasons for that. However, children may be working through what they have experienced through dark play, and so shutting it down might stop opportunities for them to really understand, right? And talk about that. So calmly talking to children and asking them questions, maybe moving aside into a private space, talking to children about and asking them questions. Oh, I noticed that you were playing with that toy and it's a gun. Tell me more about that. I'm just curious and wondering what you're thinking. In a calm way, might open opportunities to understand more of the triggers and ways to work with the children.
And that's a great way, rather than just saying, nope, we're not going to do that. It's like, okay, why is this happening? And then we can protect the safety of everyone and make sure that it's not going to be a dangerous environment, but also figure out why they're playing like that and then provide tools that they may need.
Yeah, and it may settle down. I know a friend of mine, she was teaching early elementary, and the children in the class had this obsession with weapons. Everything was weapons. So she said, well, let's do a study. And they ended up doing a long, it must have been 3-4 months, on the history of different weapons in the playroom or in the classroom. And some of her fellow teachers, I think, were questioning. Of course, she had to share what she was doing with the parents, and there was transparency in what was happening. But the children went so deep into the project, and they learned, they were counting, and there was mathematics, and they were learning new language, and there were so many learning opportunities. And soon all of the weapon play started to calm down because they had an opportunity to really work together and learn together about some of the history and background with the support of adults in the room. So some people might not want to do something like that. It depends on the context again, but it was interesting to hear her tell her story. She was in one of my master's or graduate courses and explained what had happened in this project with her, I think, grade 2 students or so.
Good for her for taking that on. Like, that can be, like, when they share that with the parents could be upset about that, or their teachers in the room could be upset about that, taking that on. But to approach it in the right way and integrate, I guess because they're a little bit older, integrate the curriculum into it as well.
The curriculum, yes.
Like that, that's a big undertaking. And listening to the children's collective interest as well. That's amazing.
So it's sort of a sense of advocacy there, and
big time.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I wrote an article about dark play, and I didn't put it on the list, but it was years ago. There was not very much in the literature at that time, but since then there's been more articles, journal articles, and writing that's come out. I don't know. Maybe we need a book.
Yeah. Just like Vivian.
Yeah, there's a lot of advantages to listening, observing, and asking questions, and then figuring out from there the triggers and how we can best work together with children and families. Yeah.
Well, for our last kind of question, to bring it up here, shift a little bit, I do see you've brought a couple other books. Would you like to share with us maybe what they are, what they're about, how they can maybe help practitioners or any of that sort of?
I brought a few books from my home library. One book that I read was just giving examples of children in war and in conflict zones, and it's called Small Stories of War: Children, Youth, and Conflict in Canada and Beyond. And it's a new book, 2023, so it's fairly current, and goes back to the world wars, so historical, and as well as more contemporary war zones. So it's a very good book. And again, I'll leave the information with you. And then more geared, so again, understanding what children might experience, you would go to books like this. And then from teachers' standpoint and pedagogical texts, this book by Joseph Tobin and his co-authors is Children Crossing Borders: Immigrant Parent and Teacher Perspectives on Preschool, which is another good book. And one called Immigrant Children in Transcultural Spaces: Language, Learning, and Love, Marjorie Orellana. So it is, again, how do we support children coming into the playroom? And I love the fact she's got language, learning, and love. Wow. That's the L word. We don't sometimes hear that a lot, although I think I'm seeing it more in the academic literature as of late. But care, yes. but coming into a loving environment where children really feel that authentic relationship building is so, so important. And I'm happy when I see that it's on the cover of one of the early childhood books. And then there are the also many resources in the community through the newcomer organizations, which I'm sure you've looked into. And I've listed a number of them, but I'm afraid to say names because I don't want to leave any out. So I will give that information to you as well. And there are other books as well and online resources, Caring for Kids New to Canada, and there are guides and supports. So doing some searching online is a really good idea. Yeah. So those are just a few.
Yeah.
But books that I have used in my own practice.
Thank you.
And relevant ones too, like newer ones that, especially with everything kind of changing right now, as I mentioned before.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we really, really thank you so much for being here with us today, Carolyn. We appreciate all your insight, like, throughout this entire degree and right now. So, yeah. Oh, no, yeah, we appreciate you. But yeah, so I guess we'll conclude now. Thank you, everybody, for listening. I'm Kaylee.
I'm Alyssa.
I'm Willa, and this is Voices of Resiliency. Voices of Resiliency was written by Alyssa Belleville, Sheldon Kopus, Kaylee Lachance, Zainab Nadim, and Willa Marshall. It is edited, directed, and produced by Willa Marshall. A special thanks to Sherry Haslam Easterbrook with lead services. Music is by Devere Silver from Pixabay.